Hi everybody, hello, morning, good afternoon or good evening. This is my second video on the topic of conservation of biodiversity, which is topic 3.4, and this should allow me to wrap up topic 3.4 and bring it to a conclusion, I believe. On the previous video on topic 3.4, I called it the need for conservation. I hope when we finish that you agreed with me that there is actually a need for conservation. So that leads on nicely to this one, which I'll call approaches to conservation. In other words, if we need conservation, what's the best way or ways to approach that requirement for conservation? Right, before I show you my key terms, I'll just click forward to the syllabus as usual. Before I read through it, you can probably just see from that if you scan through it, it's another kind of quite scattergun approach from the IB. It's a little bit all over the place. So I decided in my wisdom that I think an easy approach to the idea of approaches to conservation is to split this into two basic ideas. One, we could have in situ or on-site conservation. I would call that the protected area approach. I think the IB calls it here in the syllabus the habitat conservation approach. Both are correct. Or we could look at the ex situ approach of conservation, or off-site, which is basically the need for zoos, or we could call it the species-based approach. In other words, we concentrate on protecting particular species rather than protecting habitat as a whole. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and it says here in the first bullet point, both approaches are applicable, but we could also have a mixed approach where we do both things together. I'll talk a little bit later about the need for zoos. I think a lot of you might already be of the opinion that zoos are unnecessary, or in some cases maybe even cruel. I think I will put forward the idea that zoos can be a good thing if run properly and maintained properly, and if the animals are given certain freedoms and animal rights and animal ethics are observed. Okay, sorry for the usual waffle. Let's look at these bullet points in a little bit of detail. So conservation approaches include habitat conservation, or I've called protected area approach, or species-based conservation, or both together, a mixed approach. Then it says the criteria for consideration when designing protected areas include the size, shape, edge effects, corridors, proximity to human influence. I won't say much about that now because I'll go through each of those ideas in a little bit of detail. And then finally, this is where I think I refer to a scattergun approach. This is a little bit all over the place, and I've already talked about some of these things in my previous video. In particular, I think you already should be aware of this this idea of CITES, Convention on to prevent the international trafficking of endangered species. It also suggests captive breeding and reintroduction programs, what I've already said, the requirement for zoos, the selection of certain species, charismatic species or flagship species to make it attractive to the public, make ecotourism a possibility, and to attract donations and government involvement, flagship species. The selection of keystone species. I'll talk a little bit about that, but we've already talked about one particular keystone species, which was the Californian sea otter. A keystone species is a species that has a particular role in protecting its habitat overall. I won't talk about that now, but I'll talk about that when we get to that point. Conservation approaches require community support, a lot of funding. I would therefore suggest government support overall, because they are not don't require profit making, and they can support these kind of projects independently of private companies. And finally, location of a conservation area in a country is a significant factor. Surrounding land use for the conservation area and distance from urban centres are important. Fine in principle, but it's not always possible to decide exactly where you're going to put your protected area in advance. So I'll try and give that some thought as well. Under applications of skills, as usual, I want to approach these in the classroom, certainly with your revision for the exams. It asks us to explain the criteria used to design and manage protected areas. I want to go through that in some considerable detail. Evaluate the success of certain protected areas. We'll look at case studies. And then finally, evaluate different approaches to protecting biodiversity. And I'd like you to consider the two approaches I've suggested above my head here, in situ and ex situ. By the way, just before I move on, I mentioned in the previous video slightly different terminology. I suggested you could have a preservation approach, which would be a very ecocentric approach where you basically protect an area in terms of the exclusion of humans. That could be thought of as perhaps being an extreme version of in situ conservation. One example of that in the 1960s, I believe, was the Kruger National Park in South Africa. The South African apartheid government basically pushed indigenous people from land to create the Kruger National Park. Later on, under the black South African government, those indigenous people were basically allowed to come back onto their ancestral lands within the park. That's an example of, first of all, preservation biology, but then a shift towards this more anthropocentric approach of conservation biology. So you might want to think about that as well. I might talk about that in the classroom. Okay, so subtitle number 1, the in situ conservation approach or the protected area approach. This is all common sense, but I've made what I hope is a reasonably nice little graphic here to make it obvious. When designing a protected area, it could be a small piece of land, it could be a national park. Obviously, large areas are better than small. One large area is better than fragmented areas or islands of land to make your protected area. If you have to have separate areas, then certainly areas that are close together are better than isolated, or areas that are separated by a large distance. Much better to clump your protected areas together rather than spread them out. It's a good idea to try to produce or build corridors between your protected areas. We'll look at a nice example of that later, where the national park system of Africa, of Central Africa, was basically joined together by corridors to allow, in particular, migratory animals to move between them. And then finally, a round-shaped area is better than a flattened area because it reduces edge effects. Edge effects, if you have islands of land, edge effects are basically the deleterious effects you get around the edges. The most stable part of a protected system is going to be in the centre, and you have this kind of gradient of bad effects from the edges inwards. Those are caused by things like it makes it easier around the edges for invasive species to enter. You get more human encroachment around the edges, pollution, urbanisation effects, and then simple things like if you have at the edge of a protected area where you meet unprotected area, you get more effects on nutrient cycles, nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, more penetration of wind or light perhaps because of deforestation, all of these things. But when you get islands, the worst effects are always towards the edges, and they're called edge effects. Okay. I hope you could follow that. Okay, so criteria in general. So first of all, we can look at the idea of area. Common sense tells us that larger reserves are better than smaller ones. You can't always be that picky because the size of your reserve might be affected by national politics, national borders. Again, going back to the African park system, there was a system set up in the 90s, I think, called the Peace Parks Initiative, where basically governments in Africa decided that they could have a very loose idea of enforcing national borders across national parks, and national parks could actually spread across national borders. The best indicator of a population's health is the size of the population. and many large reserves with similar habitats and large populations guard against extinction. So you want the largest area possible, which gives you the largest population, which is the best protection against species in your reserve becoming endangered. All common sense, I hope you'd agree. This cartoon kind of represents what I just told you about. Edge effects compared to what's in the centre of the island is probably the best protected and most pristine. But obviously islands can get smaller and smaller and smaller as human activity encroaches on those edges. So when we looked at islandisation, I've said here, we saw that biodiversity increases towards the centre and it's worse on the edges. And at the edges of fragments, there are more abiotic factors, as I've said, wind, temperature variation, effects on nutrient cycles, etc. And the edges are more subject to invasion by alien species or colonisation from species from the outside, moving inwards. Okay, shape. Mathematics tells us that circular reserves have less circumference and therefore you can count on there being less edge effects. Flattened or ovoid reserves would have greater edge effects. And at the risk of repeating myself ad nauseum, very often you can't be very picky about the shape of your reserve or the size of your reserve because of very often national politics or even local politics. The idea of corridors. Corridors are a way for species, like I've said, particularly migratory species, to move between different areas. We saw an extreme example of this. We saw fragmentation in the Amazon rainforest caused by road building, and some animal species were just unable to cross a very narrow road. There was a very sad story about the Brazilian ant bird that follows army ants around the Amazon, around the floor of the Amazon rainforest, and it's psychologically unable to leave the darkness of the forest to follow its prey, lines of army ants, even if that just involves crossing a very narrow road, which is very sad. So if corridors can be put in place, it does allow species to migrate. Now I think there's quite a nice little evaluation that we can do here, because there are good things about corridors and there are some bad things. Obviously, if you're building corridors, it's out of necessity because you can't have one large reserve. Although I just told you that you know, you can have this initiative like peace parks where reserves exist and you can put corridors between them. So this is off the top of my head, so you might be able to do better than this. Advantages of corridor systems in protected areas. They allow movement of organisms to new habitats. They allow gene flow, which is very important in protecting a population against, well, basically against endangerment because of increase of deleterious genes and lack of variation. It can allow seasonal migrations, and it can help to basically make populations of certain animals more equitable. Again, going back to the Peace Parks initiative in Central Africa, one of the most destructive species in African national parks is the African elephant. If the population is allowed to get too big. If you can allow a more equitable spread of elephants, herds of elephants around national parks, you can prevent them basically pushing down trees to get to their food, and therefore you can prevent a lot of damage to individual ecosystems. Okay, you might think corridors are obviously a good idea, but I've come up with a few ideas of disadvantages. One, corridors may reduce populations too much in one area, and you might still get this clumping of individuals or large populations in one part of your reserve and small populations in another. So they might allow equitable distribution, but they also might result in inequitable distribution of the population. They could allow alien species to spread or disease. Unfortunately, they might allow poachers to move more easily between one reserve and another, which is always not a good idea. It might also make it more difficult to police one of the areas, especially against poaching. If corridors become too narrow, they can be subject to edge effects themselves and therefore become very, very damaged. And they might cross land, which presents danger to species crossing as well. They'd be more open to predation, like I said, more open to disease, etc. Okay. Another good idea for design of a protected area is the idea of buffer zones. A buffer zone is maybe a degraded area, but nevertheless an area which reduces human contact with the park. They basically are unmanaged areas that may not be in pristine condition, but they help to maintain distance between your reserve and outside influences. They can be very important in reducing edge effects, as we've already mentioned. It's generally, I've said here, generally a bad idea to allow cities or agriculture or human influence, full stop, to encroach closer and closer towards your national park, but very often it's inevitable. There's a picture here of the Nairobi National Park in Kenya, and you can see that the city of Nairobi is basically basically encroached right up into the fence of the national park. So the buffer zones don't really exist in that case. Again, that's due to national politics, and it's possibly unavoidable these days. Okay, and then just because it mentioned it in the syllabus, and it's something we have talked about before, but I just thought I'd slip it in to this section. The characteristics of a good reserve could be, well, good funding, so therefore I would suggest partially or completely funded by government, because they have access to greatest economic resources and not dependent on profit to keep your reserve open. You could look at the importance of ecotourism, the necessity to attract visitors. Although I've said here, ecotourism must be carefully controlled, or it can have a negative effect. We've seen that on the effects on the Great Barrier Reef, particularly untrained divers that very often flap around, touch corals, and cause large damage or considerable damage to the Great Barrier Reef. They should all have management programs, although you can, like I said before, go towards the preservation biology approach and exclude humans completely. I already mentioned the exclusion of indigenous people from their own land, which is again very unethical in terms of excluding humans completely. You can look to have high-profile parks, and therefore you need high-profile species. And again, I mentioned this before. Unfortunately, you're not going to have many people want to visit your park full of protected parasites or nematode worms. You basically need the charismatic species and the cuddly species, like the Bengal tiger or the orangutan, although probably not usually together, like I've shown in this picture. Those are referred to as flagship species. Zoos can look for flagship species as well, but it doesn't necessarily have to be protected areas. But you need these charismatic species to attract investment and to attract visitors. And then again, I will be repeating myself here because we've looked at this before, the idea of keystone species. You could focus your attention on trying to preserve one or maybe two particular species. Very often that's necessary because you might not have the funding to look at the ecosystem as a whole or the whole food web. Possibly the most famous example of a keystone species is the Californian sea otter. The keystone of an archway or of a piece of architecture is the stone. Wherever it's removed, the whole thing collapses. Same thing with a keystone species. If a keystone species disappears from an ecosystem, then you can expect the whole ecosystem to collapse. The reason that happened in the Californian kelp forest in the late 1800s, early 1900s, sea otters became so heavily hunted for their skins and for their fur that they disappeared almost completely from Californian kelp forests. When that happened, because they were a key predator of the sea urchins moved into the kelp forests, munched away at the holdfasts, which hold these huge kelp plants or algae to the rocks, munched away, and they destroyed whole kelp forests very, very quickly. I've mentioned this before, but very often it's not possible to really recognise a keystone species until you recognise its removal, and therefore you recognise the effect that removal had on the ecosystem as a whole. But it's worth looking at a little bit more detail, I think, in the classroom at the sea otter and the Californian kelp forest. Thankfully, they've been reintroduced. Populations are growing again of the Californian sea otter, and as a result, the Californian kelp forests themselves are starting to return. Okay, I think that concludes my first section on in situ approach So now we can look at ex situ approach, the species-based approach, or the approach of building zoos or collections of animals for breeding, perhaps more ethically, collections of animals for certain breeding programs. Okay, so the role of zoos. If you build a zoo, this is Chapultepec Zoo, Mexico City. Building a zoo, it's better to conserve endangered species rather than those that are not endangered. You have to prioritize, I think, your collection of animals and which ones you want to try and help. Automatically, different zoos have different areas of expertise. I know the real expertise of Chapultepec Zoo because I knew the director or the ex-director was the breeding of pandas. There was a huge success with breeding program of giant pandas in Mexico City. Can a zoo really afford to support conservation projects? Well, maybe the answer is that if they have the support of the public and they have the support of the government. But good zoos automatically need huge amounts of funding. And unfortunately, that's not always possible. Where the zoo is located can be important in selecting which species it can help to conserve. Maybe zoos in particular places should concentrate on the endangered animals in their area or in their country, potentially. Again, it might depend on the expertise available. And there should be dialogue between zoos and between experts in those zoos to ensure they provide help to as many endangered species as possible on a global scale. So there should be a cross-exchange of expertise between zoos, I believe. I think this is just relevant to talking about maybe putting into context how we look at in situ versus ex situ approaches. Smaller species are easier to keep in zoos rather than looking after them in situ in protected areas. Zoos should probably concentrate on species threatened. I've said that before. Species threatened due to anthropogenic factors rather than natural factors. That's possibly a point of view you might want to discuss a bit further. Sometimes habitat loss means that the only way you can actually look after a species is ex situ. We actually saw that the axolotl of Mexico City is now functionally extinct in the wild. It doesn't exist in its natural habitat anymore because its natural habitat is so polluted. Basically, Xochimilco and Lake Chalco in Mexico species. But perhaps thankfully, they're still with us because they exist in collections and zoos and laboratories even around the world. They exist because they exist ex situ and not in situ. This must be the umpteenth time I've said this, but the choice is often influenced by politics rather than scientific approaches. Species that face problems of disease should be kept ex situ rather than in situ to try to ensure that the population continues and the whole population is not infected, especially if that population has become dangerously small, critically endangered. The choice of species to be kept in zoos ex situ is often influenced by the attractiveness of the species to the general public or the application of this idea of the flagship species. I've said here, money raised by exhibiting attractive non-threatened flagship species can then be used to protect other less charismatic, less popular species. Maybe I'm playing devil's advocate, but there is a case to be made for looking after flagship species, the cuddlies rather than the creepy crawlies. Ex situ conservation should have the objective of helping to conserve the same species in situ, so there should be dialogue between zoos and between national parks or protected areas so they can work together to protect particular species. It doesn't always happen. In fact, some zoos, rather than helping to protect threatened or endangered species, can just become sometimes no better than circuses or just exhibiting animals for the pleasure of the public. I think I might mention this on the next slide. Okay, if you're going to have a zoo, I think it's important to recognise the 5 freedoms or the 5 biorights of captive animals. This originated, I've said here, from a 1965 United Kingdom government approach on animal welfare. The 5 freedoms or the 5 animal biorights are: number 1, freedom from thirst, hunger and malnutrition. You might remember the story of the thylacine that died of exposure because it wasn't free from thirst, hunger, or malnutrition. Number two, freedom from discomfort. Number 3, freedom from pain, injury, and disease. Number 4, freedom to express their normal behaviour. That's not always possible in any zoo, really, when you consider the enormous territories that some top predators in particular would have. Sometimes it's just not possible to reproduce their natural environment. And number 5, something again that is really a factor that makes some zoos very unpopular is basically guaranteeing animals freedom from fear, distress, and boredom. I'm not sure many zoos actually manage that all the time. Okay, and then I think finally, the role of zoos. Basically, I think if there is one argument in favour of zoos, it's managed breeding programs. And like I said, that can be done in conjunction with preserving their natural habitat. So hopefully you can use zoos for reintroduction to natural habitats. This is a question that we can discuss basically in the classroom, or questions we can discuss in the classroom. A good breeding program should allow freedom of choice of mates. They should allow expansion of the gene pool, and that's done again through allowing animals to choose their mates. And although on the other side of that might be that you have to, certainly in terms of very small populations, ensure genetic compatibility, ensure you have big genetic variation in the gene pool. You have to avoid as much as possible inbreeding of closely related animals. Artificial insemination is a possibility, and it would negate the need for shipping animals and therefore causing a lot of stress. In some cases when breeding programs have become very successful, you might have to employ some type of birth control to prevent populations getting too big for the zoo. Unfortunately, you do hear stories of zoos having to cull their animals or kill their animals because their populations or their collections become too large. Again, if zoos speak to each other, it's possible that individual animals can be moved to different collections, but there are some stories of animals having to be killed because there is no home able to be found for them. In some cases, animal species that you would think there would be possibilities for home and possibilities for protection. Females sometimes reject the young, so therefore some young animals have to be raised by humans or by zookeepers. And going back to the 5 animal freedoms, there should be good design of enclosures to encourage animals to mate and guarantee them the 5 freedoms. Okay, I believe that concludes what I want to do for the material for topic 3.4, conservation of biodiversity. Hope you found that useful. I'll speak to you in the classroom, and we'll look at this in more detail, certainly in terms of the applications approach and evaluation of these different approaches towards conservation. Okay, bye everybody, and I will speak to you in the classroom.